All right, well, welcome to Views from the Capitol, our State of the State edition. I am Jennifer Smith, Director of Government Relations, and with me today is our multi-client lobbyist, Matt, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Jen. Matt Curda from Carub Associates here in Lansing. It's quite a busy day here with everyone back to normal, and there's a lot going on today, so we'll have a lot to talk about. So thanks for the opportunity to speak with you guys today.
Okay, so as we go, we're going to cover the State of the State address first. This was her fifth State of the State. And then we'll talk about some of the things we're looking at for the new year coming up in session. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat as we go and we'll answer those. And we will just get started. So last night was the State of the State address. It was not a very long address. I want to say it was just under an hour with all of the applause. She started the speech by recognizing all the firsts in the room, the first female Senate Majority Leader, the first Black Speaker of the House, and along with her Lieutenant Governor, who is the first Black Lieutenant Governor. So she made a point to them up on the rostrum and that the first that she had behind her. There were two initiatives specifically that she talked about education-wise. One was in her Lower My Costs initiative, which deals with some tax relief, but also universal pre-K. And this falls under her Lower My Costs because she touted it as a way to help save families daycare money too. It not only benefits the kids, those 4-year-olds that would all have access to preschool, but to the families who have to pay for daycare or pay for private preschool. So she has a goal of creating preschool for all 4-year-olds by the end of her second term, which would be the end of 2026. So it's going to take a little time to get there, mostly because of the cost to get there. But that was her goal last night, is all 4-year-olds in public free preschool, or the ability for all 4-year-olds to attend a public free preschool by the end of 2026. And then the second piece that she mentioned was My Kids Back on Track. And this was something that she brought up last year, I believe. It didn't quite get traction. It didn't get funding in a supplemental, so she's brought it back. And what she wants to do with that is increase funding to schools to complement your ESSER funds to help replace some of those as they go away, so that you can invest in tutoring, in after-school programs, and other learning supports to give kids one-on-one support with an educator or a staff member that can help them in the places that they need help for all grades. And she challenged the legislature to put money behind that by spring break. She had put money, as I said, last spring up and no one acted on it. So we're seeing that again. And her idea is to give more resources to schools to increase those supports for their students. So it's not necessarily the tutoring program we heard about before, which was private outside entities. This is for districts to help their students. So that falls under her getting My Kids Back on Track. And as I said, she's challenged the legislature to get that done by spring break. And I'm going to turn it to Matt to talk about some of the other issues that she talked about last night.
Thanks, Jen, and sure, throw some questions in the chat here or there. We'll love to talk about what's on your minds. But just the big picture from what I see in Lansing, now that we're off to the races here, outside of what was talked about in the speech today, you're going to have a heck of a lot of news coming out. Some of it related to us, but some of it not related to us. But just I had to make sure I had the mute button on because I have Senate session on another screen. And before the end of the day, we could see Senate passage of a bill to increase the earned income tax credit. You could also see Senate passage of a bill that completely wipes out the tax changes made in 2011 on retirement income or pension tax or retirement tax, or call it what you will, depending on what you think of it. But all the stuff that happened in 2011, we've heard about this for years, of that being wiped out, all those tax changes on retirement income. It's quite a battle across the street on partisan lines right now, but I think the Senate at least is going to move something to pretty much wipe that out today. The governor's proposal had been to phase that out over 4 years. I think on the Republican side of the aisle, they wanted to do more broad tax relief just across the board without respect to pension, 401k or other, more retirement and senior tax income. I think what happened yesterday is the Senate Democrats heard that message, and so they're going to pass a bill most likely today that just gets rid of the whole thing right away. So how does that impact us directly, other than some of you who may have already been in the system? You take earned income tax credit, a couple $100 million. You take retirement tax changes, a couple $100 million. You lump that onto what happens in the coming months here if we hit an income tax reduction trigger as part of the gas tax package that was done a few years because inflation and state revenues are so high. We have $9 billion in the bank as we sit here today, but now you're looking at coming up on $1 billion of annual tax reductions, and we're only 3 weeks into the year. So it's a fascinating time where you kind of have people competing over tax cut proposals in a time of record revenue. So we're always conscious of what's going on, of course, in your world over what happens to revenue. And as Jen has said many times before, I say this to groups all the time too. You know, you have the school aid fund in one pot of money, but over the years, people have taken money out and moved money back and forth so much. We're always going to be cognizant of watching anything that happens to state revenue because all the money kind of gets put together at the end of the day. So what this all matters, how this all matters to us, I think once we get past this initial fight over revenues, there's been some procedural battles back and forth, but what we're going to see coming out of the gate here, and Jen and I will both talk about some of the issues we see up on the horizon. The new Democrats being in charge, you know, they only have 1 vote majorities. It's very tight, but they have a lot of pent up things they want to work on. So there's a lot of policy items that are pent up that they want to jump on and move. So I think once we get past today, you're going to see more of that regular policy work start once we get past this initial fight over supplemental spending and fights over tax cuts, which are going to play out here over the near future. So Jen, I don't know if you want me to jump into some policy issues or you can go first, but I'm happy to jump on those if you like.
Well, first I want to touch on the tax issues that you mentioned. It was brought up in the chat, and if you haven't heard me say this before, you probably haven't been on a call with me, but MASB has been banging the drum about tax cuts hurting the school aid fund from the beginning of my tenure here. We've gotten a lot of traction on that, and what you really see this year is the result of years of work. So the pension tax repeal, which would be a couple $100 million to the school aid fund, will not hit the school aid fund. It is drafted in such a way that the school aid fund will receive a percentage of income tax revenues to replace what would have come in with the pension tax. And what's good about the way it's written is it's not tied to how much we would have gotten from pension tax or how much we got that year from the pension tax. It is straight off the top, a piece of those income tax revenues to make sure that the school aid fund is held as harmless as possible directly. The earned income tax credit is a credit, and so it doesn't hit the school aid fund like that. It will hit the general fund. And it's one of those things that you see such good benefit from that credit, and especially to the kids that are in our schools. We've never fought against that. But we don't have to worry too much about the earned income tax credit. Where both of these things matter, though, and the income tax rollback, is as we see our revenues decrease, and we will. We've got $9 million on the books, as Matt said, but we're looking at those revenues slowing down. And so as less revenue comes in, we still have, the elephant in the room of all of the universities that are in school aid. And they have $1.5 billion to $2 billion budget, and we only have about a quarter of it in our budget right now. So that is something we still continue to have to keep our eye on. While the pension tax is written in a way to not harm us directly, it's that indirect, what else are they going to shift into us that we have to watch for? So while we're not weighing in, we are talking behind the scenes that big picture, we really need to have a sustainable revenue base in Michigan, and cutting taxes is not necessarily the way to get there. That's not a popular thing to say, but we are well below the revenues that we are allowed to collect under our Constitution. And at some point that comes back to bite us. And so we will be keeping an eye on all of that. But overall, these two big tax initiatives will not on their face affect the school aid fund. So some of the things we see coming up, we know are coming for sure. third grade reading mandatory retention. That bill is Senate Bill 12, and we expect to see that in Senate committee next week. It removes all of the things tied to retention, so there's no mandatory retention for third graders. But it does state that if the third grader is not reading at grade level or is more than a grade behind, the supports that they're receiving will continue into the fourth grade. So we're not going to just pass the kids and forget about them. You're going to pass the kids and keep supporting them, but we're not going to be required. You will not be required to hold back anyone. It gets rid of all the good faith exemptions, all of that. And so the third grade reading bill will be just that, supports for K-3 reading. That bill, as I said, will be up on, we expect it on Tuesday in the Michigan Senate. MASB is supportive of that. Unfortunately, I can't be there because I'll be attending in Washington, D.C., but we will be making our support known and urge you to let your senators know your feelings on that and how it will affect your third graders as well. Two other things that we expect very quickly out of the gate is a repeal of the A to F grading system for schools. We currently have two systems. We have the system that was okay by the feds for accountability, and we have this A to F. The Democrats, especially this one should start in the House, want to eliminate A to F. So we expect to see that bill introduced soon. And then what everyone seems to be talking about is teacher and admin evaluations. We do expect to see that bill introduced. I know they're working on some things behind the scenes, so we don't know exactly what all will be in it, but we expect to see a lot of the things we've been arguing about since the bill passed. So growth will not be 40%, whether it'll be 25 or nothing, that remains to be seen. We want to remove any, if we keep the 25% growth, remove any tie to MSTEP because that's not a growth test. We also expect to see changes in timing, both when you do the evaluations and how often, moving off of the every year to relieve some of the stress on the principals in our districts. And then the levels of effectiveness. So we have 4 levels right now. They're talking about moving it to 2 or 3. That is part of the conversation that's happening behind the scenes. So we're waiting to see what that's going to look like. There may also be something built into the bill that creates an appeal process for teachers. We don't know for sure. So we're waiting to see the final bill, but I do expect to see that within the next couple weeks. And I'm going to kick back to Matt for things that he's had conversations about.
Thanks, Jen. Those are conversations we both had this week, and think of it as it's a very different atmosphere than what we're used to. Look at the last 4 years when you had a pandemic and you had split partisan control. Everything was, it's more and more of a theater than actually any action happening, right? I mean, try to recall anything major that has happened in the last 4 years. A lot of major things just always got stuck. So it's going to be a different interest group dynamic of people who have a lot of power at the Capitol. But yeah, I think there's a world where we get to 3 months from now, we probably see the third grade reading bill potentially done, and we see an overhaul of teacher and educator evals. And these are things we've been at for years. We don't know what the final products will look like, but it's interesting just to see the dynamic of what's going to be talked about and what's not going to be talked about. We're going to see a lot of discussions on educator support, educator and student mental health. It's just going to be different. We're going to have a change of kind of everything that we've been doing day to day. Not saying it's all good or bad. It's just very different than what we've been used to over the last few years. And I want to touch on a couple comments that were made in the chat on GSRP and preschool. This is another sea change. There's some good comments made there. We've gotten to a point where, GSRP, many of you remember it when it was MSRP back in the day. It's grown, it's grown, it's grown. The funding has grown. The eligibility thresholds have grown. And think of a lot of, I'm sure there's many of you out there that have young fives or, kindergarten or what we call them programs. You kind of have both sides of the scale kind of getting closer and closer and closer, the traditional K-12 world and the GSRP world. And factor in, how do we deal with income limits? How do we deal with childcare? How do we deal with, all these different systems we have here? This discussion is going to be a fascinating one to watch because there's a lot of players in this space. When you decide you're going to go down the road of universal preschool, philosophically, I think there's a lot of agreement in the K-12 world of whether or not that should be an option. But it's not as easy as flipping the switch overnight. And there's a lot of systems that have been built over the years that may need some changes. So I just think we're going to want to participate and bring some ideas to this discussion. I know you all have a lot of ideas on ways to do it. But just flipping the switch to say, we now have added another grade. There's a lot of transition challenges there. And I'm not the one to say who's the right or wrong thing, but we've never really had this discussion before, really, in the state. It's always been siloed. So that's going to drive a lot of discussions that we have this year. And remember, we've got a lot of revenue out there to take advantage of. So I think that what does early education look like for people in that age cohort is going to be pretty fascinating going forward.
One of the other questions in the chat was about right to work and prohibited subjects. We do expect to see a repeal of right to work. I don't think we'll see that right away. There's some talk about trying to do things that they can agree on and work together on before they go out and try to repeal the big things. But the bills are introduced, and so I would expect to see them this year. I don't know when. The thing to keep in mind is even if they repeal right to work in Michigan, it does not apply to the public sector. The US Supreme Court has said that you cannot require a person to be a part of a union. A public employer cannot require a person to be part of a union as part of their employment. And that basically set up right to work for the public sector across the nation. So unless that US Supreme Court changes, even if Michigan repeals right to work, it will not affect the day-to-day operations for schools because of the US Supreme Court. Prohibited subjects of bargaining, absolutely expect to see those too, but I don't know what. They have created a labor committee in both the Senate and the House, so anything that goes through the para would run through that. And until we see bills introduced, I don't know what to tell you as far as what they're going to try to put back on the table. There's a lot of things that are prohibited. There's very few things you're allowed to bargain these days. So I would expect that the MEA and AFT are probably working on that and the list that they'd like to see. And so we'll have to see what is actually introduced. I'm sure we will engage when those are introduced. And so we will be sure to let you know when they happen, what they're looking at, and what the bill says. And there's a question, I see your hand up, Steve. I want to answer one more question before I get to you. There's a question there about how we get our positions. And I realize this is probably the first government relations webinar that some of you have been on for some of our new members. We have a government relations committee here at MASB that we create with members from all over the state and all different types of districts. So any information or any bills that come to us that we need positions on goes to that committee for discussion. And then their position is taken to the board of directors for final approval or changes or things like that. So for Senate Bill 12, that is one that is run through our committee. It also was a legislative priority last session to remove mandatory retention from the third grade reading bill. So support for that bill was pretty simple because we knew it was a legislative priority last time. It didn't make the list this time, but it was still brought up everywhere we went. For A to F and eval, until we get the bill, we won't have a formal position. But when A to F passed the first time, MASB opposed it because of how onerous it was and the fact that we already had an accountability system. So we'll have to see what they do, if it is just a straight repeal or what the bill says. As I always tell the committee and anyone who asks, the devil is always in the details. So while I can tell you we opposed A to F before and would probably support the repeal, it depends on how it's written and it depends on what the committee says. I don't make the changes on my own, or I don't make the decisions on my own. They're made with backup from the members. The eval changes is something we have been working on for years. So again, devil's in the details. We're going to have to see what all they put in that bill and what they do, and if it matches things that we have worked on through the years. So when we put things up on our advocacy website, we know our position. We're building a brand new advocacy website, but we will try to put in there what the bill does and then why we have the position, how it affects public schools. So we're building that. Be patient with us. It's a brand new site. They just switched us last fall. So not only are we starting from scratch in the legislature, but we're starting from scratch on that website. So we will try to have the information you're looking for there. But also, if you ever have a question, feel free to reach out and ask. I'm happy to answer. I'm happy to tell you about the discussions we have in committee and in government relations. We also use our resolutions to help guide our decisions, and those are adopted every year by the membership. So we use all the information I can get at my disposal, but the most important information is from all of you. I need to know what's happening on the ground. I need to know how it affects your districts, because I can speak at a statewide level. I can't speak at that lower level. And that's where I always call on all of you as well to contact your reps and senators and tell them how these things affect you, because I can't explain for over 500 districts how it affects every single one, but you can. So my job is to let you know what's going on and the basis of what's going on, what the bill does, but then I ask you to help me lobby on those issues. And now, Steve, I see you have your hand up and you've been very patient. What can I do?
Thank you. I originally emailed you saying I wasn't gonna be able to make it today, and I was able to move a meeting.
good.
My issue is on the GSRP side of it. I'm all for universal preschool, and I support doing what we did with all-day kindergarten, where we make it available to schools and incentivize them and encourage them to go to all-day kindergarten. Currently, I think about 96, 98% of the schools in the state of Michigan have achieved all-day, everyday kindergarten. GSRP, we talk about student to teacher ratio. We need to talk about bureaucrat to student ratio. The amount of adults it takes to manage the GSRP bureaucracy takes away slots from our kids. I currently have a brand new room that I offered to my GSRP. They were given 3 again this year. They're only using 2, and my students are being underserved. I don't own the slots. GSRP owns the slots. And so I have kids not getting preschool, even though I've got space for it to happen. So if we could move preschool into make it pre-K-12. Currently it's funded out of the general fund. So GSRP doesn't know their funding levels till September, October. And so they're leaving parents scrambling. Did I get a slot? Did I not get a slot? And that's not all GSRP's fault. Part of that's because it's not funded in the school aid fund versus the general fund. And so they don't have the information to make a timely decision. Some of the benefits to the other side, if we made it pre-K-12, they would be certified teachers and they would be able to be part of the union and work through that, versus we're currently in our county not paying. My parapros are making as much as some of my GSRP teachers, which is why I don't have a 3rd classroom. So I support universal preschool, but not the universal bureaucracy that GSRP has created. And I think we could save money and give every kid a chance for preschool if we rethink the way we do it.
That's really great feedback, Steve. And like Matt said, I think this is going to be a long discussion to figure this out. And that's the sort of information that helps us as we talk to them. I don't know. She did mention Great Start Readiness Program and running some of this that way, but that's Great Start Readiness Program is not universal. So I think that there's a lot of moving parts to that, and there's going to be a lot of discussion around it. And one of the questions, if universal preschool is brought in, would that become a requirement or enrollment for parents to enroll like they do for kindergarten? Again, we don't know the answer to that. My guess would be yes, but we don't know. And to be clear, like it's not going to be a requirement for parents. It's not going to be required of 4-year-olds. Kindergarten is actually not required. You don't have to start school until you're 6 years old in 1st grade. That's a weird thing that I don't think a lot of people realize, but that's how it works in Michigan right now. So I would say preschool would probably fall under a kindergarten type enrollment, but that's all things to be determined that we don't know at this point. Well, unions have to collect, or districts have to collect union dues. There is a movement, we are hearing about it, we haven't seen it introduced yet, to once again allow districts, if they would like, to deduct the union dues directly out of the paycheck. I know some districts are fine with that, other districts have an issue. We haven't seen the bill, of course, but that is something we expect to see to allow that to happen again. I know that if you do it that way, you have a better idea of who in your district is in the union, which might be helpful under the right to work, but we'll have to wait and see what the language in the bill says. But yes, that is something we expect to see. Hard cap and 80-20. These go back and forth. Originally, we had heard absolutely we're going to talk about it. And now we're hearing, well, I don't know. So we're actually taking a look at those laws internally and things that we didn't like how they were written to begin with. Are there changes we would like to see? And so we'll probably end up talking to some of the unions on that issue. Again, haven't seen it introduced yet. Wouldn't be surprised to see it, but the absolutely we're going to talk about it seems to have died down a little. I don't know if I'm wrong on that, Matt, please jump in, but that hasn't been the forefront issue, but we do think we'll talk about it eventually. The number of kids for a GSRP teacher, this goes to a different section with licensing, and I can't really answer that question without looking into it. I don't know, Matt, if you know more, but this would fall under some of that daycare sort of licensing things because it is the younger kids. So that we'd have to look into a lot more. That's not a school code. I believe that's in either LARA or the licensing and regulation, I think is where it falls. But it's not a school code thing. So we would have to look into that. And again, as we continue forward, as we're talking about universal pre-K, we need to talk about how we're funding that. And it should be a per pupil, just like kindergarten is, I would think. Again, we don't know.
So Jen, the interesting tidbit, I have a early childhood special education room of 4-year-olds in my school that's through my ISD, and none of the rules that apply to healthy 4-year-olds apply to my early childhood special education room. So I have a binder this thick of all the rules for my healthy 4-year-olds, and the rules for the GSRP or the early childhood special ed kiddos are the same as my kindergartners. And they're my most medically fragile kids in my district. So again, we've added layers when it doesn't make sense to add layers.
Right. I didn't realize that. Thank you for that. Real quick, because I saw it in the chat, somebody asked, what is GSRP? Please ask if I use acronyms or any of us use acronyms and you don't know what they are. We get so used to it, and education has so many acronyms. Please don't hesitate to ask. You're probably not the only one who doesn't know what it means. Yes, significant discussion on small and rural schools. We heard that as we did our roadshow for the priorities. And so these are things that we are pulling together, conversations we're still having with all of you to figure out what does make sense. Part of that is transportation. Transportation costs are vastly different for a very rural district and a very tight urban district. And there needs to be a way to acknowledge that. There was a study that just came out through the School Finance Research Collaborative. They finished their transportation study. So we'll look at that. We'll look at the budget. But there does need to be an acknowledgement. If we heard anything, transportation was the biggest piece. There needs to be an acknowledgement of how much is spent per pupil in a rural district or a small district versus per pupil in a tight urban district. So I think that transportation conversation is absolutely going to happen. We got a couple steps toward that in the last couple of years in the budget, but then it would get morphed into something else and thrown out. So we'll keep talking, we'll keep trying. On the other small rural school issues, I think there's a lot there that we can look at and a lot there we can talk about. And so that's going to be an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I would jump on to what Jen said there and saying, you know, what one shift we've seen in the conversations that we're having at the Capitol is just in the last few weeks, we're going in to meet with the people that are going to be writing our budget. And the tone of the conversations when we bring up something like, what are we going to do for advancing things in the School Finance Research Collaborative? How can we invest in things that high performing states and systems use? Can we talk about things like transportation? It's been a change. You know, the reception so far has been, let's do it. What do you guys want? Let's be big. Let's be bold. It's different because it's just been a really strange dynamic in recent years. So I think things like transportation funding ultimately it's a, it's a game between how much, if we're in the same pot of money, how much do you do in a foundation versus what do you do in transportation? But as Jen noted, SFRC has had some additional study in that world, and I think we can have a conversation on things like that this year, different categoricals and transportation. That's one that cuts both ways. That's something that if you're in a rural part of the state, it's something that's very real for a legislator, and a lot of legislators are so new. I think it's a great thing to latch onto in some districts to give them something to run with at the Capitol. I also think it's interesting talking about transportation. One thing I heard this week is, how many years have we said we wanted to do something simple like allowing sinking fund for school buses? And people would always kind of hide when we bring that issue up, and they'd hem and haw. I hate to say, to make predictions, I think it might happen this year, just because we brought it up to chairs and they've said, yeah, that's why haven't we done this for years? That saves schools money. And then I'll say, oh, well, there's some groups in town that say it doesn't, and they wrinkle their nose going, well, I think we should do it. So that's an issue where we're so used to being defensive and we've given up. It's an issue where I think it probably could happen. So, well, let's think bold, let's think big. Steve makes some great points on GSRP and universal preschool. Let's have the discussion. I could throw out, what should we do in early childhood to 10 people, and then get 10 different opinions. That's okay. We can have these big discussions now, and are there right or wrong answers? I don't know, but let's talk about it, because we have a willing audience willing to have the conversation. So I'm a little big picture thinking on my part here in the clouds, but we have to change the way we kind of are approaching all the lobby work that we're doing, and we can try some new things.
And sinking funds on school buses is a great thing. I actually was contacted by a senator's office last week saying they were looking into it, and that they would send me a bill draft. So I'm waiting for that. And we may get traction. It's always getting past the chamber. That's been our problem before, is the Michigan Chamber of Commerce has consistently opposed expansion of sinking funds. We were able to get security and technology a few years ago. That was the first change we had in years. But school buses is something I've heard since the day I started here 10 years ago. And if we can do that, then I think I'll call my decade tenure complete. So we'll work on that. Hopefully we'll have more news on that in the coming weeks. Sustainable funding for health supports, mental and physical providers such as school psychs, counselors, social workers, and school nurses. We keep hearing that mental health is important and the mental health of our students is important. So I would expect that funding to stay. As far as sustainable, that's the issue, is we need to make sure that they're writing the language in such a way that you can continue to use it and it doesn't run out and now you have a counselor you can't afford to pay. That's always the glitch in the system, is trying to get programs that are sustainable, not just right now, hire today, great, you've got one. We know there are shortages in those areas. And so it's hard to spend money if you don't have a person to spend it on. So that will be a big part of our budget conversation. She will deliver her budget on February 8th, and that will really kick off budget season. But that will definitely be a big part of the budget conversation, as well as this transportation issue. And question about a bill pending to ensure financial transparency for charter schools. We have heard about this. The House Democrats had a package last year that I would expect to see again, that dealt with all different parts of financial transparency. And it's not the school itself, it's the education management organizations. The charter schools are under the same transparency issues and buttons and all of those things that you have to do, but they can just say contracted services, and then the EMO is the one that really doesn't have to show their books. So that's what I believe the House Democrats will go after. Again, haven't seen them. The bills last year, the package last year was something that our committee supported. But we'll take another look this year when it comes back out. I do expect to see that, absolutely. John, you have your hand up.
I do. I don't know if there's anything you can do about this or not, because my recollection is that people tried to do something about it when Sinking Fund was expanded to include security and technology, and in spite of the efforts, it did not allow current sinking funds to do it. So we just didn't renew our sinking fund. We sought a new one so that we could use it for security and technology. Passed in August, we're good for 10 years. If they add transportation now, we'd have to do another sinking fund unless you can somehow have that written in such a way that existing sinking funds can be used for that transportation. So again, I don't know if you can do something about it, but it would be helpful if you could.
And I don't know either. I know we looked at that before, and the problem is when you put a tax issue on the ballot, it has to say exactly what it will be spent for. And so I don't think you can modify it without going back to the ballot. The question that we didn't really answer last time was, could you go back to the ballot to modify an existing sinking fund? And that's the part that I don't really know. But definitely something that we'll look at, because you're right, a lot of people waited to do their security. They probably have a brand new sinking fund out there. But I know you can't just throw buses into something that it wasn't described for before. But the question was, could you modify by vote of the people what the sinking fund is for without having to go out for a new one? I don't have the answer to that, but it's definitely in our notes to find out. Teacher shortage. So we saw some things, and you're right, most of it was funding for college students and for student teachers. I think that's a first step. I haven't seen new initiatives yet. We saw last year, we saw grow your own programs. We saw scholarships for people going into education. We saw stipends for student teachers. We saw stipends for counselors, social workers, school nurses. And that doesn't solve the problem today. I don't know that I have the answers either. I'm going to call on Matt to see what he's heard too. Some of these are conversations. And again, when we have big ideas, that's what we need to hear. I haven't heard what we may see this year other than a continuation of the programs we've already seen. I don't know, Matt, if you've heard about anything new that we may see coming up.
Not much, I think it's pretty fair to say what we heard a lot of yesterday was they're going to continue to be, everyone wants to make their education budget a record budget. We've heard it a million times before. I think it's going to be interesting to see how some of these programs that were developed in last year and categoricals, which I kind of consider, hey, let's put a bunch of money into this pot and throw it in and let the department figure it out. Well, you've got a lot of money in our budget that's just kind of still waiting in the ether at MDE. So it'll be interesting to see, how much does the governor want to let those discussions play out, or do we kind of change? One thing we're always frustrated in our world is, programs that change year by year by year by year, and then you have to find a grant for this, you have to find a grant for that. We'll see what she comes up with, but we're going to hear on the 8th. The 8th is the big day here in a couple weeks, so we're all in wait and see mode, trying to get some bits and pieces of what we hear, and we'll pass them along as we get them.
There is a comment from Gary Wood in the chat about using sinking fund language that says, and all other purposes authorized by this law. I'm not going to pretend to be Brad. And every webinar, there's an I need to ask Brad question. But that may be one way to get buses in it when the law has changed. But that is going to be something that we'll have to look at, and we'll make sure that we are very clear when we send the information out and when the bill is introduced and all of that. We will do our best to be as clear as we can about how you can use that and when you can use that for buses. John? You're still muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I unmuted. I'm not Brad either, but I can tell you that when we had that language about and all other uses in the law, and we were told that still did not allow us to use it for security and technology. The answer you gave earlier, that if it wasn't explicitly in there, it wouldn't work. So that's what we were told. So that we were told that won't help.
Good to know. Funding on the horizon for updating school buildings and demolishing ones. So there was money put in the budget this year for consolidation and for infrastructure needs. There was money put in the budget this year for a study on what the state needs for infrastructure. And that you had to participate in the study in order to qualify for the funds. It's really, really messy. The study is not done yet. I don't know at what stage the study is at. The infrastructure grants are not created yet, partially because the study isn't done and partially because this has been really difficult for the department to pull together because it's a different sort of way of doing things. And so MDE has told us they're working on it, but it's not simple. But we also heard the study isn't done. And then anything that for the grants has to be reappropriated by the legislature. So we're hoping that we can get this cleaned up in this budget. Make it easier for you to access the funds, make it easier for you to get that state support for infrastructure. We are one of only 7 states in the country that doesn't have state support for their school buildings. It is purely local. And so we were really excited to see that acknowledged and added into this budget, but it was done so messily that we haven't been able to do anything with it. So that's going to be one thing we're going to work on is cleaning that up, make sure it stays in there. I believe it's about $500 million right now. Not enough for the state, but it's enough to get started. So keep your ears to the ground on that one. We hope to have easier, clearer information for you as the budget process goes forward this year. But at this point, the money is just sitting there because there's no way to access it, which it should roll over to next year. But we'll have to see how we can clean that up and make it easier for you to access it. It is one of the big equity questions across our state is just the buildings and the infrastructure in districts. And because of the tax bases, they're so different. So this is a really important thing we've talked about a long time. And here's our chance. Like I said, be big, be bold. We're going to try to fix that or at least address it. Discussions beyond revising school funding, beyond what was imposed by Proposal A. I always said we wouldn't get changes to Proposal A because people only had 6 or 8 years to address something. And rewriting Proposal A is not going to be an overnight project. This is going to be a massive lift by someone. And the problem is, while there are people out there who would be willing to do it, they look at the end time and say, but I want to be remembered for something. I want something that I did, so I can't spend all my time on Proposal A. So we have term limit changes now that you can do 12 years in all the same chamber versus having to change or 12 years split. That may make a difference in people being able to lift some of these big issues. Proposal A is not the only big issue on the books that needs to be looked at, but people are just unwilling to do it when they think that's all they'll spend their time on. So will we see things like that? Maybe. I do think we'll see a little more digging into SFRC and changing our funding system as far as making it more equitable and not just the equal per pupil. But at the end of the day, we're still paying for butts and seats, and that's Proposal A, that's student count, that's all of that. So I do think it's one of those big, bold conversations we can have. One of the conversations we're starting with is the blended count and changing that to a more stable count, having it roll over 3 years, giving you more stability in your budgeting. That's a small first step, but these are conversations that need to be had with schools being consistently underfunded, and Michigan's birth rate is declining. Our state is getting older. Our middle-aged people are moving. We don't have as many kids. Every year we lose kids across the state. So declining enrollment is not a district issue, it's a state issue. And as long as we're funding butts and seats, we're going to continue to see funding go down for districts. So maybe this is the time we do it. We've been asked, specifically, I was asked by the Approps chair for the K-12 budget to come to him with big, bold ideas and see what we can do. This is definitely one of them. How do we fix that? How do we fix the structural issues and how we fund our schools? Any curriculum specific focus for this legislation driven by the party now majority in the House and the Senate? Potentially. We saw a package introduced last year by Senate Democrats that was specific curriculum to various ethnic groups. And each one was a separate bill. What we'd rather do is sit down with them and with MDE and let's talk about our curriculum standards. Because you can say you have to teach it, but if it's not tested, if it's not in the standards, schools aren't going to give it the attention that the bill sponsors would like it to see, because the schools have to teach what's going to be tested. So I think if we want to have these curriculum conversations, they need to be done at that broader level. And that's what we'll be talking to the bill sponsors about. So yes, I do think we'll see some, but I also think that the conversations will be a little bit easier about what it means when you tell us we have to teach one specific thing in one specific class. We may be able to have that bigger conversation, or at least I'm hopeful that we can. Is there another state that has a funding model that works well, and can it be adapted for Michigan? That's one of the bigger problems. As I talk to my counterparts across the nation, we all handle things differently. Our school aid fund is largely funded, majority funded by our sales tax. There's not a lot of states like that. Looking at different states' funding models can give us ideas, but I don't think there's anything that we could absolutely copy, because we all handle the funding differently. So there are funding models that probably work well, or they work well in that state, they may not work well here. That's one of the harder things about how localized our education systems are, is they're also state localized. So the way we handle it is not the way that even our surrounding neighbors handle it. Changes to mandated standardized testing. I haven't heard, but wouldn't be surprised. There is concern we do too much mandated standardized testing. Anything different? Have you heard anything on that, Matt?
It comes up more often. Remember, I'll kind of be a broken record here, but I think it's good to remember the 4 chairs that we deal with most often now, the 2 education chairs and the 2 K-12 education budget chairs. They were all in the classroom in the last 10 years. Like, we got 4 teachers. So think about that. That's just that I don't remember if we ever had that happen in the state. So yeah, I hear things, I hear people saying, can we, get rid of some standardized testing requirements, that, teacher testing and things like that. They're not always going to be on the same page as the department, but I've heard more discussions about backing off some of these things in the last 3 weeks than I have in the last 4 years. But there's a lot of things that need to come first. I mean, it's good to remember, while we have different majorities, like there's a 1-vote majority in both chambers. So if someone has a cold or has COVID or has had a baby and can't get here, everything grinds to a halt. So we probably got 6 months, 7 months here where they do a budget, but they can't do everything. They have to pick and choose. And the farther along we go, the harder things get. So there's a lot of things in play. I think the things that we kind of talked about at the start, that's what we're going to see in the first 3 or 4 months. A lot of these other issues, we just don't know yet. But the farther we go along, the harder it gets to do things. So there's a honeymoon period here, but it's going to end very quickly.
And if you haven't seen the news, one of our brand new state reps had a brand new baby on Tuesday, I think it was, and they needed his vote to get to 56. And so he drove in that night. People described him as rumpled and tired, but he showed up to cast that vote. So, I mean, it may sound funny, but it's the absolute truth. It's 56-54 in the House, and you need 56 votes to pass anything. So if they can't get bipartisan support of something, they have to have every single Democrat there. And that changes how they approach some of these things, because they're going to need Republican votes on them. And so some of the big ideas they may want to do, they're not going to be able to do on their own. Would we support state mandated curriculum? When we see some of these bills that come through, they're like, you must teach about this specific thing. We generally go to that bill sponsor with the same thing I said earlier. If you want it taught, it needs to be embedded into the curriculum, and it needs to be thought about from the standard side, not the individual one-off piece. So we don't necessarily weigh in on the specific bill, but we try to make them see that bigger picture. We don't want state mandated curriculum. We want the standards, and then you figure out how you get there. How do you teach the things that need to be done? We've always supported that. When we see things that are like, this curriculum needs to be taught, we make sure it says things like MDE shall create a template or suggested or encouraged, so that you do have the space within your district to either just adopt what MDE put out there and do it straight, or adjust it to fit your students in your community. We would not support an absolute, this is how you have to teach it. That's not something that we've ever been for. That goes against the local control in your district. And you know your district better than the state does. And what works in one district does not work in another. And so what we push for is that bigger umbrella, and the districts get to figure out how they get their students to the different levels that they need to get to. Funding for curriculum and textbooks, we won't hear about. I don't think that would be part of your per pupil. That is where we would push for the increase per pupil for operating costs. We have always fought against individual line items for very specific things. Getting them for big picture things like at-risk, transportation, special ed, like that makes sense. But when you get down to the individual things, we'd rather they gave you a big pot of money and told you to spend it how your district needs it. Any other questions? Sorry, I'm skimming the chat real quick, but are there other questions as I skim that? Cheryl, I am interested to talk to anybody who wants to get involved. You let me know, I'm there. And that goes for anybody on this call. If you want to get involved, if you don't know how, reach out, I'll help. We also have CBA 108, and that will tell you too. But anytime you have questions, if it is a shyness or I don't know how to contact them, I'm happy to help. Happy to be with you in Lansing, go with you, whatever. The more people I can get involved, the better. And the easier my job is, and the stronger our voice is, and MASB's voice, the more people I have there with me. A workload that is more simple, efficient, and cost affordable is, I think, every educator's dream. And we did have a conversation with a representative recently when they're talking about what do we do to keep teachers in the system? What do we do to keep administrators in the system? And part of it was paperwork. It's paperwork. That teachers want to teach, they don't want to fill out all the reports. Administrators want to support, they don't want to fill out all the reports. So I think we'll keep banging that drum, see what we can do. Like, the number of reports that a district has to fill out in a year is insane. And so if we can look at what's required versus what's necessary versus what's duplicative, and maybe take a deep dive into all of that. I think that goes to, Casey, your comment about a job that's harder to do today than yesterday. Every time the legislature seems to add something, there's always some sort of reporting requirement. And that means paperwork, and that means tracking. And while they want these reports, they want to know if things are working, there's got to be a better way to do it. And I would argue that student growth and graduation rates increasing are the answer to, is something working? But that is a conversation we will have. And the legislator we brought it up to sort of looked at us like, well, I hadn't thought about it that way. So we got to get them to think about it that way. Like, just because one teacher has to report for third grade reading, that same teacher is also reporting on her IEPs, reporting on her 504s, thing after thing after thing. And so many of these things are done in a silo. And we need them to look at that broader picture. Any other questions or things we can answer for you? We will make this available hopefully tomorrow. It will go out in News from the Capitol. So if anybody you're with or anybody you know didn't get a chance to watch today and they're interested, we will have that available. I would also say for all of you on this call, if you are not receiving News from the Capitol, it's gone out twice now, it'll go out tomorrow. first check your spam folder. We changed as I mentioned earlier, we changed our site. They switched us to a whole new provider. So it is coming from Voter Voice. So some of your spam filters may be catching that because it's not the same newsletter system we had before. So first, check your spam, and second, let me know. We have uploaded new members. We may not have caught them all. We'll do another upload before we do a budget review. But check with your fellow board members, make sure they're receiving it. Our advocacy system is different than our main system. We keep them separate because our advocacy system includes people that are not members, but may be involved in the schools. So we have to pull the data from our main system, put it into our advocacy system, and sometimes there's glitches. So please let us know if you're not receiving it, have anyone else that you know is not receiving it. We want to make sure that you're getting all the information that we can put out there for you. Thanks for being here today. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for your engagement and advocacy. And as I say all the time, if there's ever anything I can do to help, let me know. And I will talk to you all again real soon.